Chapter 13. "Run for it!" Joe yelled. The boys whirled and dashed through the tunnel. As the train rapidly gained on them, its headlight illuminated the walls, stretching along one side with a power line encasing in a metal piping. Frank spotted it. "There's a conduit line," he shouted. "Grab it and flatten yourself against the wall." They made a desperate leap, caught hold of the narrow piping, and stiffened themselves hard against the wall. And seconds later, the train sped past them. The roar was deafening, and the mass of air that was pushed along lashed the boys like a gale. The sides of the cars were bare inches away as the lit windows passed by in a blur. Soon the last car disappeared around the bend. The youths jumped upon the tracks and made their way back to the Times Square station platform, and both were trembling. "What do you think happened to the fellow that we were chasing?" Joe asked finally. "Probably he used this tunnel before as a means of escape," Frank asked, "and knows the layout well. I'm sure he's heading for Grand Central Station." Arriving at the platform, the boys spotted the man Chris's pal had tried to rob. He was talking to a police officer. "These are the two boys who chased that pickpocket into the tunnel," the man told the policeman as the boys walked towards him. The officer turned to Frank and Joe. "This man that claims someone stole his wallet." "That's right," Frank said. "And he's probably the same one who lifted mine this afternoon. We chased him, but he got away." "By now, he has no doubt reached Grand Central," Joe added. "I've alerted a couple men on duty there," the policeman said. "They'll be on the lookout for him." He stared at the boys curiously. "Say, that was a risky job for you fellers to take on." The boys introduced themselves to the officer and showed him their credentials. "So, you're the Hardys," the policeman remarked. "I'm Riley. Your father's name is something of a legend around the department." "Well, Dad is a great detective," Joe said proudly. At the officer's request, the boys gave him a description of the pickpocket. Riley then took the name and address of the man who had been robbed. Shortly, the next train arrived, and the Hardys stepped aboard. When they got off at Grand Central Station, Frank and Joe noticed a commotion at the far end of the platform, and a group of spectators were assembled. "Let's see what's going on," Frank suggested. As the boys walked forward, Joe's eyes widened. "Hey, look, there's that pickpocket we chased." "He's being questioned by two policemen." "That was quick work. They must have nabbed him coming out of the tunnel," Frank observed. The boys pressed their way among the spectators. "I ain't done nothing," they heard the pickpocket snarl. "That's not true," Joe declared. "He tried to steal a man's wallet. My brother and I saw the whole thing. And I suspect he took mine and is a pal of some smugglers," Frank added. "Who are you?" one of the policemen asked. The boys identified themselves at once, then related the incident at the Times Square station. One of the officers nodded. "We were alerted to be a lookout for this fella." "And we know all about him," the second policeman said. "His name is Torchy Merks. Has 2 convictions for petty larceny. And we had reports of a pickpocket that looked like him working the subways recently." "You're crazy. I'm being railroaded," Merks growled. "Yeah, we'll see about that." The officers requested the boys to accompany them, and at the precinct Merks was marched off to the interrogation room. A few minutes later, a tall, muscular, square-jawed man emerged from the squad room. He walked directly to the Hardys and extended his hand in greeting. "One of the officers told me that you're the sons of Fenton Hardy," he said. "That's right." "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Detective Lieutenant Danson. I joined the force as a rookie just before your father left the department. A great detective. Come on into my office." The youths were ushered into a small but comfortable office where Danson offered them chairs and seated himself behind his desk. I hear you fellas had a scrap with Torchy Merks, he said. He's a slippery character. Well, tell me, what brings the famous Hardys to New York City? The boys related their experiences of the past 2 weeks, ending with an account of how they had trailed the smuggler kidnapping Chris to New York. Lieutenant Danson sat thoughtful for several minutes. Well, that's strange, he murmured to himself. What is? Joe inquired. Well, it might just be a coincidence, Danson muttered, but then again... The boys watched with interest as the lieutenant thumbed through his private list of telephone numbers. An FBI agent I know, named Emery Keith, dropped into my office a couple days ago and told me about 2 suspects his office wants for questioning. And from his description of the men, one of them sounds like this big blonde fella Chris. Of course, our men have been on the lookout, but I'd like Keith to hear your story. 20 minutes later, 2 neatly dressed men arrived at the lieutenant's office. I'm Agent Keith, the tall, light-haired one said to the Hardys. Then he introduced his shorter, dark-haired companion. And this is my assistant, George Mallet. I've heard a lot of talk about your father, and some of our agents have even worked with him. After the formalities had finished, they all sat down to discuss the case. Frank and Joe told their story about the kidnapping and smuggling. Keith said. Interesting lead. The agent eyed the Hardys for a moment before speaking again. Does the name Taffy Meyer ring a bell with any of you fellas? I'm afraid not, Frank replied. Taffy Meyer, Frank went on, is one of the slickest crooks in the country. He is the leader of the smuggling ring, and I suspect is the boss of Shorty, Chris, and their pals. Meyer is young, innocent-looking type, but as clever and cold-blooded a crook as you've ever come against. What else can you tell us about his looks? Frank asked. Not much. Taffy is slender, of average height, and uses a lot of disguises, so we're not exactly sure what he does look like. One of our men did spot a triangular scar on Meyer's left forearm. No doubt he's self-conscious about this identification, and he usually wears long sleeves. Taffy came from the West Coast a few months ago and organized a gang, Keith went on. The group had been flooding the country with smuggled diamonds. It's so bad that the Jewelers Association is offering a sizable reward to anyone who can trip up that Meyer. And as for me, I'd give a year's salary to put him into prison. Joe volunteered the information that the gang also smuggled electronic equipment and added, Have you any leads on Meyer's whereabouts? Well, the last report shows that he was here in New York, the agent answered. Before that, it was Florida, then Virginia, and then Connecticut, New Jersey, and the Carolinas. He most certainly gets around, commented Frank. Well, apparently he's confining his operations now to the East Coast, but the problem is where. He seems to have dropped out of sight completely. How long do you 2 plan to be in New York? Keith asked the Hardys. Not too much longer, Joe said. We called home for some money, and it should be at the Grand Central Telegram office by now. We plan to take the first train back to Bayport. Tell you what, Keith said. Why not let us put you up in a hotel tonight at our expense, and then you can catch the morning train. I'd like to have breakfast with you fellas and discuss the possibility of your working with us on this. But I'd like to talk with my chief first. Frank and Joe were excited at this prospect and quickly consented. Lieutenant Danson drove them to Grand Central, where they found their money waiting, and then they went to a nearby hotel. Completely exhausted, Frank and Joe were sound asleep within minutes. Early the next morning, they met Keith at the hotel restaurant and enjoyed a breakfast of sausage, wheat cakes, and fruit. Then the agent reviewed the facts of Meyer and his gang. I realize our information is kind of sketchy, the agent said, but you've given us some good leads, and maybe you can dig up a few more. Well, we'll certainly try, Frank said. I'd like you fellas to be on the lookout for Mar in the Bayport area, and the same goes for Chris. He may turn up there again, perhaps to meet Mar, if they are indeed in the same racket." "Well, you can sure count on us," Joe said eagerly. Keith reached into his pocket, took out a small business card, and on the back he jotted down a series of digits. "I suggest you memorize this telephone number," he said. "You'll be able to get in touch with me or my assistant, Mallet, at any time." "Right." The Hardys repeated the digits several times until both were sure that they wouldn't forget them. Frank telephoned to check for trains and learned that one would depart for Bayport within half hour. So Keith drove them to the station and then shook hands. "Good luck and good hunting," he said with a grin. "I can assure you that the entire Bureau would be grateful for whatever help you can give." When the boys arrived home, Joe jokingly stuck out his chest and said to Miss Hardy and Aunt Gertrude, "Well, meet a couple federal men." "What do you mean?" his mother asked. Frank told of Keith's request, and the women smiled. "It's a big assignment," Miss Hardy remarked, and Aunt Gertrude added, "Well, you better watch your step. This Mar fella sounds pretty dangerous for you to tackle." "Now tell us," Joe requested, changing the subject, "about this fake inventor. Did the mysterious caller ever come for that box with the secret radio in it?" "Yes." "And was he caught?" Frank asked eagerly. End of chapter 13.